She stood there in her tailored Chanel suit, tossing her platinum blonde hair over her shoulder as she signed the divorce papers with that signature Victoria Whitmore smirk. The same condescending smile she'd perfected over our 8-year marriage whenever she thought she had me cornered. Her attorney, some shark in a $1,000 tie, was practically salivating as he watched her initial each page. Victoria's sister Emma sat in the gallery, already texting what I assumed were celebration plans. But when Judge Richardson adjusted his glasses and began reading the asset disclosure statement, when he got to the part about my actual net worth, that smirk didn't just fade. It shattered like crystal hitting concrete. The silence in that courtroom was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, and for the first time in years, Victoria Whitmore was speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is David Chen, and 8 years ago, I thought I was the luckiest man alive. I was 28, working as a software engineer at a mid-level tech company in Seattle, pulling down a decent $75,000 a year. Nothing spectacular, but enough to live comfortably in my studio apartment in Capitol Hill. I spent my evenings coding side projects, not because I had to, but because I genuinely loved the puzzle of creating something from nothing. My weekends were simple: hiking the Cascades, grabbing beers with my college buddy Marcus, or visiting my parents in their modest Bellevue home, where my dad still taught high school physics and my mom ran the school library. I met Victoria at a charity gala for Seattle Children's Hospital. I wasn't supposed to be there. My company had bought a table, and when one of the VPs came down with food poisoning, they needed a warm body to fill his seat. I borrowed a suit from Marcus, spent 20 minutes on YouTube learning how to tie a proper Windsor knot, and showed up feeling like an imposter among all the silk dresses and platinum watches. Victoria was standing near the auction display, an emerald green that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She had this effortless elegance, the kind that comes from a lifetime of private schools and country clubs. Her laugh carried across the room like music, and when she smiled, it was magnetic. I was nursing my second glass of wine, trying to look like I belonged, when she walked straight up to me. "You look like someone who's calculating the mathematical probability of escaping through the nearest exit," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of playful mockery. I nearly choked on my wine. That obvious? Only to someone who spent half her life at these things. She extended her perfectly manicured hand. Victoria Whitmore. David Chen. Her handshake was firm, confident, the grip of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. "So, David Chen, what do you do when you're not plotting your escape from charity galas?" "I write code, make computers do interesting things. Nothing as glamorous as this." I gestured around the ballroom with its crystal chandeliers and live orchestra. "Interesting." She tilted her head, studying me like I was a puzzle worth solving. "Most people here would have led with their title or their company's valuation. You just said you make computers do interesting things." We talked for 2 hours. She told me about her work at her family's investment firm, how she'd graduated from Wharton and was being groomed to take over the private wealth management division. I told her about my latest project, an app that helped small businesses optimize their inventory management. She listened like it was the most fascinating thing she'd ever heard, asking technical questions that showed she was actually paying attention. When the evening ended, she handed me a card. "I'd like to see this app you're building, and maybe you could show me some of those hiking trails you mentioned. I've lived in Seattle my whole life and never been to Rattlesnake Ledge." I called her 3 days later, convinced she wouldn't remember our conversation. She picked up on the first ring. "David, I was wondering when you'd call. Are you free Saturday? I bought hiking boots." Our first date was surreal. Victoria showed up in designer athletic wear that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, but she gamely followed me up the muddy trail to Rattlesnake Ledge. She slipped twice, laughed at herself both times, and when we reached the summit, she stared out at the view of Mount Rainier with genuine wonder. "I can't believe I've never done this," she said, pulling out her phone to take pictures. "My father always said hiking was for people who couldn't afford ski resorts."
"What do you think?" She was quiet for a moment, then turned to me with a smile that seemed different from the polished one she wore at the gala. Softer, more real. "I think your father might have been wrong about a lot of things." The next 6 months were like living in a fairy tale. Victoria would pick me up in her BMW, and we'd drive to restaurants I'd only read about in Seattle Met. She'd order wine that cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a week, then insist on paying because you're saving money for that business you're going to start. She talked about my entrepreneurial ambitions like they were inevitable, not pipe dreams. She started staying over at my tiny apartment, laughing at how I'd converted the dining nook into an office space. "It's cozy," she'd say, curled up on my secondhand couch while I worked late into the night. Like a startup founder's origin story. Victoria would bring me coffee from this boutique place downtown, the kind with single-origin beans and foam art. She'd leave little notes tucked into my laptop bag, building the future, one line of code at a time. She'd sit beside me for hours reading business journals while I debugged applications, occasionally looking over to ask about what I was working on. I thought I'd hit the lottery. Here was this brilliant, beautiful woman from a world I'd only seen in movies, and she was genuinely interested in my life, my dreams, my decidedly unglamorous daily routine. She made me feel like I was destined for something bigger, like my quiet ambition was actually a superpower she could see when others missed it. When she suggested we move in together after 8 months, I didn't hesitate. She found us a penthouse apartment in Belltown, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. The rent was more than my entire salary, but Victoria waved off my concerns. "Consider it an investment in your future," she said, signing the lease with a flourish. "Besides, my trust fund covers it. When your company takes off, you can pay me back if it makes you feel better." I should have paid attention to how easily she solved problems with money. I should have noticed how she never talked about budgets or savings or any of the financial realities that had shaped my entire life. But I was too busy being grateful, too caught up in the whirlwind of dating someone who seemed to believe in me more than I believed in myself. The apartment was stunning. Marble countertops, a kitchen bigger than my old entire studio, a master bedroom with a walk-in closet that Victoria immediately filled with clothes that cost more than my car. She hired a decorator, and within a month, our place looked like something from Architectural Digest. Our place. That's how she always referred to it, even though my name wasn't on the lease and I couldn't afford to contribute more than a token amount toward utilities. But Victoria made me feel like a partner, not a charity case. She'd cook elaborate dinners, using ingredients from Pike Place Market, then sit across from me asking about my day, my projects, my ideas for the future. "Tell me about the inventory app again," she'd say, refilling my wine glass. "Walk me through the algorithm." And I would, for hours. She'd ask intelligent questions, suggest market applications I hadn't considered, connect me with people in her network who might be interested in what I was building. She introduced me to venture capitalists at dinner parties, always leading with how brilliant I was, how she couldn't wait for them to see what I was working on. At her family's annual Christmas party, she paraded me around their Magnolia mansion like I was her greatest accomplishment. Her father, Richard Whitmore, was polite but distant, the kind of man who measured people by their portfolio values. Her mother, Patricia, was warmer, asking about my parents and my background with what seemed like genuine interest. "Victoria tells us you're building something revolutionary," Patricia said, balancing a martini glass with practiced ease. "I don't know about revolutionary, just trying to solve a problem that small businesses deal with every day." "Modest," she laughed. "Victoria likes that about you. She says you're not like the other men she's dated." I later learned that the other men were trust fund babies, Harvard MBAs, and tech bros who'd sold companies for 8 figures before turning 30. But that night, standing in the Whitmore's marble foyer with Victoria's hand in mine, I felt like I belonged in their world. Victoria and I got engaged on New Year's Eve, watching fireworks from the Space Needle observation deck that she's somehow gotten them to open privately for us. The ring was a family heirloom, a 3-carat diamond that had belonged to her grandmother. When she said yes, tears streaming down her face, I thought my life was complete. "I love you, David Chen," she whispered against my ear as midnight struck. "I love your brilliant mind and your kind heart and the way you see the world like it's full of problems you can solve. We married 6 months later in a ceremony that cost more than my parents' house. 300 guests, a string quartet, flowers flown in from Holland.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victoria's family handled everything, and I let them, focusing on my work and trusting that the woman I loved knew what she was doing. The honeymoon was 2 weeks in Bali, staying in a resort where the cheapest room cost $1,000 a night. Victoria had booked the penthouse suite without asking me, and when I expressed concern about the cost, she kissed my cheek and said, "Let me worry about money, darling. You worry about changing the world." For the first 2 years of our marriage, that dynamic worked. Victoria handled all our finances, paid all our bills, managed our social calendar. I focused on my day job and my side projects, working toward the day when I could launch my own company. She was my biggest cheerleader, my fiercest advocate, my connection to a world of resources and opportunities I never could have accessed on my own. But somewhere around year 3, things started to shift. It was subtle at first. Victoria would make little comments about my clothes. "Are you really going to wear that shirt again? I bought you those new ones from Nordstrom." Or about my schedule. "You missed the Hendersons' anniversary party. People notice when you don't show up to things like that." She never said anything directly critical, never raised her voice or made demands, but there was an undertone, a gentle pressure that made me feel like I was constantly falling short of some standard I didn't fully understand. When I brought it up, she'd laugh and say I was being oversensitive, that she was just trying to help me put my best foot forward in social situations. "You're brilliant, David, but you don't always think about how things look," she'd say, adjusting my tie before a dinner party. "Image matters in business. You'll thank me when you're raising your Series A." I started to feel like I was always being managed, always being optimized. Victoria would suggest I read certain books, attend certain networking events, connect with certain people. Her advice was always sound, always well-intentioned, but it began to feel less like partnership and more like being handled by a very skilled public relations manager. The criticism became more frequent, though always delivered with a smile. "You were a little quiet tonight," she'd say after we left a dinner party. "The Morgans were asking about your app and you barely engaged." Or, "I know you prefer casual restaurants, but when we're dining with my father's clients, we should probably aim higher than that burger place you love." I found myself constantly second-guessing my instincts, editing my responses, trying to anticipate what Victoria would want me to say or do in any given situation. The confidence she'd once praised began to feel like something that needed correction, refinement, professional polish. At the same time, my side projects were gaining traction. The inventory management app had attracted attention from several small business owners who were willing to pay for early access. I was making decent money on the side, enough to contribute more substantially to our household expenses, but when I offered, Victoria waved me off. "Save it for your company launch," she said. "Besides, my father's firm is doing well. Money isn't an issue." But money started becoming an issue for me, psychologically, if not practically. I felt increasingly like a dependent, like someone being supported rather than someone building something valuable. When I expressed this to Victoria, she seemed genuinely confused. "You're building a business, David. That's your contribution. Why would you want to waste time worrying about rent and utilities when you could be focusing on scaling your platform?" She was right, logically, but emotionally I felt diminished, like I was living in a beautiful cage, comfortable but not quite free. The penthouse apartment began to feel less like home and more like a very nice hotel where I was a long-term guest. Victoria's social circle became increasingly important to her, and by extension, to us. She joined the Junior League, volunteered for various charitable organizations, attended endless networking events and fundraisers. She was building her own career at the family firm, taking on bigger clients and more responsibility. I was proud of her success, but I felt increasingly out of place in the world she was constructing around us. "The Washingtons are having a yacht party next weekend. It's important that we're there. Senator Mitchell is supposed to attend, and his wife sits on the board of 3 organizations I'm trying to get involved with." I'd nod and agree because that's what supportive husbands do. But standing on a yacht in a suit that Victoria had bought for me, making small talk with people whose idea of financial struggle was choosing between the house in Aspen and the one in Maui, I felt like an actor playing a role I'd never auditioned for. Victoria thrived in these environments. She was charming, sophisticated, politically astute. She could discuss market trends with hedge fund managers, art with gallery owners, and wine with collectors, all while looking effortlessly elegant. I admired her competence, but I also began to feel like I was holding her back, like my middle-class background and straightforward personality were social liabilities she had to constantly manage. "You don't have to try so hard," she said one evening after a particularly awkward dinner party where I'd spent most of the night listening rather than contributing. "Just be yourself." But being myself increasingly felt like being wrong. My jokes were too simple, my interests too narrow, my conversational style too direct for the sophisticated circles we moved in. I started to wonder if Victoria was embarrassed by me, if she was beginning to realize that marrying the earnest software engineer had been a mistake. Around year 4, Victoria's behavior toward me began to change in ways that were harder to rationalize. She would roll her eyes when I talked about my projects or check her phone while I explained a technical problem I was working through. The woman who had once asked detailed questions about algorithms and user interfaces now seemed barely able to tolerate hearing about my work. "That's nice, honey," became her standard response to any news about my business development. She'd say it without looking up from her laptop or her phone, in the same tone someone might use to acknowledge that it was raining outside. I told myself she was just busy, stressed with her expanding role at the investment firm. But when I suggested we plan a weekend getaway, just the two of us, she sighed like I'd asked her to do something unreasonably difficult. "I'm swamped right now, David. The Peterson account is demanding, and I can't just disappear for a weekend. Maybe next month." Next month became the month after that, then the month after that. Our conversations became increasingly logistical. Who would attend which social function, what needed to be picked up from the dry cleaner, when the housekeeper was coming. The deep talks about dreams and ambitions that had characterized our early relationship disappeared entirely. Victoria started working longer hours, or at least claiming to. She'd come home at 9 or 10 at night, pour herself a glass of wine and retreat to her office to catch up on emails. When I offered to cook dinner or suggested we watch a movie together, she'd smile politely and say she had too much work to do. "This is the price of success," she'd say, as if the distance between us was an unfortunate but necessary sacrifice. "You understand that, right? You're building something too." But I wasn't building something that required me to be absent from my marriage. My projects were demanding, sure, but they didn't prevent me from wanting to spend time with my wife, from being interested in her day, from maintaining the emotional connection that had drawn us together in the first place. I started to feel like we were roommates who happened to share a bed, two people pursuing parallel lives under the same expensive roof. Victoria would come to bed after I was already asleep, and in the morning she'd be up and dressed before I woke up. We could go days without having a real conversation, weeks without any physical intimacy beyond perfunctory pecks on the cheek. When I tried to address this directly, Victoria would become defensive. "I'm working incredibly hard to build something meaningful," she'd say. "I thought you of all people would understand the demands of professional ambition." She wasn't wrong, exactly. I did understand professional demands, but I also understood that relationships required attention, effort, prioritization. Victoria seemed to have decided that our marriage was stable enough to ignore that I would simply be there when she had time for me. The social events continued, but now they felt more like work assignments. Victoria would brief me beforehand about who would be there and what topics to avoid. She'd critique my performance afterward, always constructively, always with my best interests at heart, but it felt increasingly like being managed by a coach rather than loved by a wife. "You seemed distracted tonight. The Hendersons were asking about your business and you gave very brief answers. These are networking opportunities, David. You should take advantage of them." But I was distracted because I was beginning to realize that Victoria saw me less as a husband and more as a project, something that needed to be optimized and presented well, but not necessarily cherished or prioritized. The woman who had once been fascinated by my thought processes now seemed to view my introverted tendencies as social deficits that required correction. By year 5, I felt like I was living with a stranger who happened to look exactly like the woman I'd fallen in love with. Victoria was still beautiful, still intelligent, still professionally successful, but the warmth, the curiosity, the genuine affection that had characterized our early relationship had been replaced by something cooler, more transactional.
She managed our social calendar like a business strategy. She managed our household like a corporate operation. And increasingly, she managed me like an employee whose performance was adequate but uninspiring. Someone who could be counted on to show up and do the basics, but wasn't quite executive material. I threw myself deeper into my work, partly because it was the only area of my life where I still felt competent and valuable, but also because it seemed like what Victoria wanted from me. If I couldn't be the charming, sophisticated husband she deserved, at least I could be the successful entrepreneur she had invested in. My inventory management platform was gaining serious traction. I'd signed several major clients, and the revenue was becoming substantial enough that I was considering quitting my day job and focusing on the business full-time.
But when I shared this news with Victoria, her response was lukewarm. "That's great, honey," she said, not looking up from her phone. "Just make sure you've thought through the financial implications. Steady income is important." I was making more from my side business than from my day job, but Victoria seemed to have stopped paying attention to the details of my professional life. The woman who had once been my biggest cheerleader now treated my entrepreneurial success like a hobby that had gotten slightly out of hand. This emotional distance began affecting me in ways I didn't immediately recognize. I started doubting my own perceptions, wondering if I was being unreasonable in expecting more attention from my wife. Maybe this was just what marriage looked like after the honeymoon phase. Maybe I was being needy, asking for more emotional intimacy than was realistic for two busy professionals. Victoria was still beautiful, still accomplished, still the kind of woman other men envied me for marrying. When people complimented me on my gorgeous, successful wife, I'd smile and agree. But inside, I felt like they were describing someone I used to know. The turning point came during our 5th wedding anniversary. I'd planned a romantic dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date, but Victoria canceled at the last minute because of a client emergency that required her immediate attention. She promised we'd reschedule, but when I suggested alternative dates, she was always too busy. "Marriage shouldn't require this much scheduling," I said one evening, trying to keep my frustration out of my voice. Victoria looked at me like I'd said something profoundly naive. "David, we're not college students anymore. We have responsibilities, careers, obligations. Romance can't always be the priority." But it wasn't just romance that had disappeared. It was connection, partnership, the sense that we were building something together rather than living separate lives that occasionally intersected. I began to wonder if Victoria had simply outgrown me, if the ambitious engineer she'd fallen in love with had turned out to be less impressive than she'd anticipated. I started paying more attention to how she talked about me to other people. At parties, she'd introduce me as my husband David, rather than describing what I did or mentioning my business. When people asked about my work, she'd give vague, dismissive answers that suggested it wasn't worth discussing in detail. "David's still figuring out his entrepreneurial path," she'd say, as if I were a recent college graduate, rather than a man who'd built a profitable business while maintaining a demanding day job. The shift was so gradual that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when Victoria stopped seeing me as an equal and started treating me like a well-meaning but ultimately disappointing investment. But by year 6, it was unmistakable. I had become someone she tolerated rather than someone she celebrated, someone she managed rather than someone she chose. And the worst part was that I started to believe her assessment of me was correct. If my own wife couldn't get excited about my success, maybe it wasn't as significant as I thought. If the woman who knew me best seemed to find me increasingly unremarkable, maybe I was fooling myself about my own worth and potential. I started noticing the receipts by accident. Victoria had always handled our finances, paying bills from her trust fund and managing our credit cards through some complex system I'd never bothered to understand. But one evening, while looking for a phone charger in her purse, I found a crumpled Visa statement that had apparently fallen out of her wallet. The charges were puzzling. Dinner for 2 at Keneallis on a Tuesday night when she'd told me she was working late with a client, a weekend spa package in Snoqualmie that I'd never heard mentioned, hotel charges from the Four Seasons downtown dated on nights when she claimed to be at business conferences in Portland. The amounts weren't enormous, but they painted a picture that didn't match the story of Victoria's life I thought I knew. I told myself there were logical explanations. Maybe she was treating clients to expensive dinners. Maybe the spa package was a gift for her sister Emma. Maybe the hotel charges were legitimate business expenses that got billed to her personal card by mistake. But something in my gut said otherwise. A cold awareness that I'd been willfully ignoring signs that were becoming impossible to dismiss. Victoria's work schedule had become increasingly erratic over the past year. She'd leave for the office at normal hours, but wouldn't return until 10 or 11 at night, claiming that client demands were more intensive than ever. Her phone had become a constant companion, buzzing with texts and calls at all hours. When I asked about her day, she'd give vague answers about market volatility and difficult investors, nothing specific enough to follow up on. She'd started dressing differently, too, more carefully, with an attention to detail that seemed excessive for managing investment portfolios. New perfume, more expensive lingerie that I rarely saw her wear around me, professional outfits that looked more like evening wear than office attire. When I complimented her appearance, she'd smile distantly and say something about needing to look the part for high-stakes client meetings. The emotional distance that had been growing between us over the past few years had become a chasm. We lived in the same beautiful apartment, but inhabited separate worlds. Victoria would come home exhausted, pour herself a glass of wine, and disappear into her office to handle what she described as urgent client communications. Our conversations had devolved to logistics: who would attend which social function, when the cleaning service was coming, whether we needed to order groceries. Physical intimacy had virtually disappeared. Victoria was always too tired, too stressed, too preoccupied with work challenges. When I tried to initiate any kind of romantic connection, she'd sigh and say she needed space to decompress from her demanding day. I started sleeping in the guest room, partly to avoid the rejection, but also because I was beginning to feel like a stranger in my own bedroom. I found myself wondering if this was just what long-term marriage looked like, if the passion and connection we'd once shared was inevitably replaced by comfortable routine and parallel lives. But there was nothing comfortable about the tension that filled our apartment, the careful politeness that had replaced genuine affection, the way Victoria seemed to flinch when I touched her shoulder or suggested we spend time together. My business had reached a crucial inflection point. The inventory management platform was generating serious revenue, enough that I was finally ready to quit my day job and focus on scaling the company full-time. I'd been documenting every aspect of the business development process, partly out of natural diligence, but also because I'd learned to protect my intellectual property after watching other entrepreneurs get burned by careless record-keeping. What Victoria didn't know was that I'd been planning for this transition for over 2 years. Not just the business launch, but the financial independence that would come with it. I'd structured everything through a series of limited liability companies and business partnerships that kept my actual ownership stakes private. The inventory platform was just the visible tip of an iceberg that included licensing deals, consulting contracts, and equity positions in 3 other startups. I learned early in my career that the tech industry was full of brilliant people who'd built valuable companies only to lose control of them through poor legal and financial planning. So I'd spent years quietly assembling a team of advisors who specialized in protecting intellectual property and structuring business assets in ways that minimized tax liability and maximized operational flexibility. My attorney, Sarah Kim, was a specialist in technology law who worked out of a small practice in Pioneer Square. She wasn't flashy or expensive, but she was thorough and discreet. She'd helped me set up the corporate structure for my platform and had guided me through the process of securing patents for the underlying algorithms. She also handled the legal framework for my consulting work and my equity investments in other companies. My accountant, Robert Martinez, was a former Microsoft finance executive who'd started his own practice helping tech entrepreneurs navigate complex tax and business structure issues. He was the one who'd suggested the multi-entity approach that kept my various income streams separate and protected. He also managed the investment accounts where I'd been quietly building a portfolio that Victoria knew nothing about. I'd been living well below my means for years, maintaining the lifestyle of a mid-level software engineer while my actual income had grown substantially. The money went in 2 investments, real estate partnerships, and business development funds that were completely separate from the joint accounts Victoria managed. I told myself this was just prudent financial planning, but deep down, I think I was preparing for the possibility that our marriage might not survive.
Victoria's behavior had become so unpredictable that I started paying closer attention to patterns. She'd disappear for entire weekends, claiming to attend professional development conferences or client retreats. But when I looked up the events she mentioned, they either didn't exist or had completely different dates than what she'd told me. Her explanations for her absence became increasingly elaborate and less believable. One Friday evening, she announced that she'd be spending the weekend at a financial planning seminar in Vancouver. She packed an overnight bag with clothes that seemed more appropriate for a romantic getaway than a professional conference. When I offered to drive her to the airport, she quickly said she'd already arranged for a car service because the timing was too tight. After she left, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the seminar she'd mentioned and found that it was actually scheduled for the following month. I checked Seattle Airport's flight departures to Vancouver and found only 2 that evening, neither of which aligned with her departure timeline. The evidence was circumstantial but accumulating, painting a picture I was beginning to understand but wasn't quite ready to confront. That weekend, alone in our apartment, I made a decision that would change everything. I stopped pretending that Victoria's behavior was explainable through work stress or normal marital evolution. I started treating our relationship like a business problem that required investigation and analysis, and the first step was understanding exactly what I was dealing with. I hired a private investigator, someone Sarah Kim had recommended for handling sensitive corporate disputes. His name was James Fletcher, a former Seattle police detective who'd transitioned to private security after 20 years on the force. He specialized in asset protection and business intelligence, the kind of discreet investigation work that helped executives and entrepreneurs protect themselves from various forms of professional and personal threats. My instructions to Fletcher were simple. I needed to understand Victoria's actual schedule and activities. I wasn't looking for scandal or dramatic revelations. I needed facts, documentation, a clear picture of what my wife was actually doing when she claimed to be managing investment portfolios and attending business meetings. Fletcher's initial report arrived by encrypted email 10 days later. Victoria's work schedule was nothing like she'd been telling me. The investment firm where she claimed to spend 12-hour days had no record of her working past 6 p.m. on any day in the previous month. The conferences and seminars she attended were either fictional or significantly different from her descriptions. More concerning were the credit card charges Fletcher had traced through public records and corporate filings. Victoria had been using company credit cards to pay for personal expenses, including hotel stays, restaurant meals, and retail purchases that had nothing to do with client management or business development. The pattern suggested systematic personal use of business resources, which could constitute fraud depending on how the expenses were documented. But the most damaging information was photographic evidence of Victoria's actual activities during her supposed business trips. Fletcher had followed her to what she'd described as a client meeting in Portland, only to discover that she'd actually spent the weekend at a luxury resort in the Columbia River Gorge with a man I didn't recognize. The photos were discreet but unambiguous. Victoria laughing over dinner, walking hand in hand along hiking trails, entering a romantic hotel room together. I stared at the photographs for a long time, feeling strangely calm.
This wasn't the explosive, emotional devastation I'd expected. It was more like finally getting the answer to a question I'd been afraid to ask. Victoria wasn't just emotionally distant from our marriage. She'd actively replaced it with something else, someone else, while maintaining the pretense that we were simply going through a rough patch. The rational part of my brain started calculating implications and next steps. If Victoria was having an affair, our marriage was effectively over regardless of whether I confronted her about it. If she was also misusing corporate resources to fund her personal activities, she was potentially facing legal consequences that could affect both of our finances. And if she was systematically lying about her whereabouts and activities, then everything about our relationship was built on a foundation that had already crumbled. I scheduled a follow-up meeting with Fletcher to discuss additional investigation. I wanted a complete picture of Victoria's activities, not just the romantic relationship, but the financial irregularities and professional misconduct that seemed to be part of the same pattern of deception. I also wanted documentation that would hold up in court, because I was beginning to realize that this situation was likely to end in divorce proceedings.
Fletcher's expanded investigation revealed a level of systematic deception that was almost impressive in its complexity. Victoria had been conducting multiple relationships simultaneously, using her supposed business travel to maintain what appeared to be ongoing affairs with at least 3 different men. Each relationship was carefully compartmentalized, with different credit cards, different social media accounts, and different cover stories. The financial irregularities were equally extensive. Victoria had been systematically inflating her business expenses and using corporate accounts to fund personal activities. She'd also been transferring money from our joint accounts into private investment vehicles that only she controlled. The amounts weren't enormous by the standards of her family's wealth, but they represented a systematic pattern of financial deception that had been going on for over a year. Most significantly, Fletcher discovered that Victoria had been consulting with a divorce attorney for several months. She'd been meeting with Margaret Thornton, one of Seattle's most aggressive family law specialists, discussing asset protection strategies and potential alimony claims. The consultation notes that Fletcher obtained through his contacts in the legal community suggested that Victoria was planning to file for divorce and was strategically positioning herself to maximize her financial settlement. This revelation changed everything. Victoria wasn't just having affairs or going through a midlife crisis. She was systematically planning to end our marriage while positioning herself to claim as much of my assets as possible. The emotional distance, the financial deception, the elaborate lies about her schedule, they were all part of a coordinated strategy to extract herself from our relationship on the most advantageous terms possible. I realized that Victoria had been treating our marriage like a business transaction for months, possibly years. She'd been calculating the optimal timing for divorce, documenting my income and business activities, and building a narrative that would support substantial alimony claims. Meanwhile, she'd been living a completely separate life, funded partly by my earnings and partly by her misuse of corporate resources. The knowledge was liberating in an unexpected way. I'd spent months questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was being unreasonable and expecting more from our relationship, doubting whether the distance between us was my fault. Now I understood that Victoria had been systematically deceiving me while planning her exit strategy. I wasn't losing my mind or failing as a husband. I was being played by someone who was much more calculating than I'd ever imagined. I began planning my own strategy. If Victoria wanted to treat our marriage like a business transaction, I would approach our divorce with the same systematic preparation I'd bring to any major business negotiation. She had advantages in terms of family wealth and social connections, but I had something she didn't know about: a complete understanding of what she was actually doing, documented evidence of her deception, and a financial position that was much stronger than she realized. The first step was assembling my own legal team. Sarah Kim recommended a family law specialist named Catherine Walsh, whose practice focused on high-asset divorces involving business owners and entrepreneurs. Walsh had a reputation for meticulous preparation and aggressive advocacy for her clients. She also understood the complex financial structures that characterized modern tech industry wealth. My initial consultation with Walsh was eye-opening. She reviewed Fletcher's investigation report and immediately identified several potential legal advantages. Victoria's systematic financial deception could be classified as dissipation of marital assets, which would work against her in any divorce proceeding. Her use of corporate resources for personal activities could constitute fraud, potentially exposing her to criminal liability. And her pattern of systematic lying about her whereabouts and activities would undermine her credibility in any court proceeding. Walsh also explained how Washington state's community property laws would apply to our situation. In theory, all assets acquired during marriage were subject to equal division, but there were exceptions for inheritance, gifts, and separate property that could be clearly documented as belonging to one spouse. More importantly, courts had discretion to award unequal distribution when one spouse had dissipated marital assets or engaged in financial misconduct.
I began providing Walsh with detailed documentation of my business activities and asset structures. She was impressed by the level of organization and legal protection I'd built into my various enterprises. Most of my significant assets were held through business entities that predated my marriage or could be clearly documented as separate property. The community property subject to division was much smaller than Victoria probably realized. Walsh recommended that we conduct our own asset investigation before Victoria filed for divorce. If she was planning to claim significant alimony based on my supposed income and assets, we needed to be prepared to demonstrate that her assumptions were incorrect. We also needed to document her own financial misconduct and present evidence that would support our own claims for relief.
The investigation revealed that Victoria's financial position was more complex than I'd realized. While she had access to significant family wealth, much of it was held in trust structures that limited her direct control. Her income from the family investment firm was substantial, but not as large as I'd assumed based on our lifestyle. The expensive apartment, the luxury vacations, the designer clothes, they were being funded partly by trust distributions, but also by systematic overspending that had put her in a precarious financial position. More concerning was evidence that Victoria had been using her position at the family firm to manipulate client accounts for personal benefit. Fletcher's investigation uncovered trading records that suggested she'd been engaging in front-running and other forms of securities fraud. The amounts involved were significant enough to constitute felony violations of federal securities law. I realized that Victoria's divorce planning wasn't just about extracting money from our marriage. She was potentially facing criminal exposure for her professional misconduct, and she needed liquid assets to fund legal defense and lifestyle maintenance if her access to family money was restricted. The divorce settlement she was planning to demand wasn't just greed. It was financial necessity driven by her own illegal activities. This knowledge gave me significant leverage, but it also created ethical complications. If Victoria was engaging in securities fraud, her victims were her clients and potentially other investors who'd been harmed by her misconduct. I had a responsibility to consider whether this information should be reported to regulatory authorities, regardless of how it affected our divorce proceedings. Walsh and I discussed the ethical and strategic implications extensively. We decided to focus initially on protecting my interests in the divorce while preserving the option to report Victoria's professional misconduct if it became necessary. The goal was to achieve a fair divorce settlement without unnecessarily escalating the situation into criminal proceedings that could affect multiple parties. I began preparing for divorce by systematically documenting everything. Every conversation with Victoria was recorded when legally permissible. Every financial transaction was traced and categorized. Every piece of evidence about her deception and misconduct was organized and preserved. I was building a comprehensive case that would demonstrate not only that our marriage was irretrievably broken, but that Victoria's own behavior had caused its destruction. The emotional toll of this preparation was significant. I was essentially building a legal case against someone I'd once loved deeply, documenting her betrayal and deception in excruciating detail. But I also felt a sense of clarity and purpose that had been missing from my life for years. For the first time since the problems in our marriage had begun, I felt like I was taking meaningful action rather than passively accepting an unacceptable situation. Victoria seemed oblivious to my investigation and preparation. She continued her pattern of deception and emotional distance, apparently confident that I was too passive or naive to recognize what was happening. She maintained her facade of being overwhelmed by work demands while continuing her affairs and financial misconduct. Her confidence in her ability to manipulate the situation was almost pathological. I started testing Victoria's commitment to honesty by asking specific questions about her activities and schedule. Her answers were consistently false, but delivered with such conviction that I began to understand how she'd been able to deceive me for so long. She wasn't just lying, she was creating elaborate alternative realities that she seemed to believe herself. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. Victoria could look me in the eye and describe a business meeting that had never happened, provide details about client interactions that were completely fictional, and express frustration about work demands that existed only in her imagination.
She'd constructed a parallel life that was so detailed and consistent that she could inhabit it completely while maintaining our marriage as a kind of background operation. I realized that Victoria's deception wasn't impulsive or emotional. It was systematic and strategic, the behavior of someone who'd made calculated decisions about how to structure her life to maximize personal benefit while minimizing accountability. She'd turned our marriage into a financial and social resource that she could exploit while pursuing her actual interests elsewhere. This understanding helped me approach our impending divorce with appropriate emotional detachment. I wasn't losing a loving partner who'd made mistakes or grown apart from me. I was ending a business relationship with someone who'd been systematically exploiting our partnership for personal gain. The emotional stakes were still significant, but the strategic considerations were much clearer. As winter turned to spring, Victoria's behavior became even more erratic. She'd disappear for days at a time, offering increasingly implausible explanations for her absence. She'd return home in moods that ranged from euphoric to hostile, as if she were struggling to maintain the emotional compartmentalization that her double life required. Her treatment of me alternated between condescending dismissal and aggressive irritation, as if my very presence was an inconvenience she was tired of managing. I maintained my facade of naive acceptance while continuing to document everything. Fletcher's surveillance reports became increasingly detailed, providing a comprehensive record of Victoria's activities and relationships. Walsh's legal preparation became more sophisticated, incorporating financial analysis and strategic planning that would position us advantageously for any settlement negotiations or court proceedings. The strange thing was that I felt calmer and more confident than I had in years. The uncertainty and self-doubt that had characterized my emotional life were replaced by clarity about what was happening and determination to protect my interests. I wasn't losing a loving partner who'd made mistakes or grown apart from me. I was ending a business relationship with someone who'd been systematically exploiting our partnership for personal gain. The emotional stakes were still significant, but the strategic considerations were much clearer. By April, I was ready to force the confrontation that Victoria had been avoiding. I had comprehensive documentation of her affairs, her financial misconduct, and her systematic deception. I had a legal team that understood the complexities of our situation and was prepared to advocate aggressively for my interests.
Most importantly, I had clarity about who Victoria really was and what our marriage had actually become. The only question was timing. Walsh advised that it would be strategically advantageous to let Victoria file for divorce first, since it would allow us to respond with evidence of her misconduct rather than appearing to initiate hostilities. But Fletcher's intelligence suggested that Victoria was planning to file within the next few weeks, which meant the confrontation was imminent regardless of my preferences. I spent those final weeks preparing emotionally for the end of my marriage. There was grief involved, not for the relationship that was ending, but for the relationship I'd thought we had, the partnership I'd believed in, the future I'd planned that would never exist. But there was also anticipation, a sense that I was finally going to be free from a situation that had become unsustainable. Victoria's behavior during this period was almost manic. She was spending money aggressively, traveling constantly, and treating our apartment like a hotel where she occasionally stayed between other commitments. She seemed to be building towards some kind of dramatic gesture, perhaps the divorce filing that would allow her to drop her pretense and pursue her actual life openly. I realized that Victoria had probably been planning this ending for much longer than I'd suspected. The emotional distance, the financial deception, the elaborate lies about her schedule, they were all preparation for a clean break that would leave her free to pursue her other relationships while extracting maximum financial benefit from our marriage. She'd been treating me like a soon-to-be ex-husband for months, possibly years. The knowledge was clarifying rather than devastating. I understood finally that our marriage hadn't gradually deteriorated due to incompatibility or changing priorities. It had been systematically destroyed by someone who decided that its costs outweighed its benefits and who'd been planning her exit strategy while maintaining the facade of commitment. I was ready for whatever came next. The papers arrived on a Thursday morning in May, delivered by a courier service to my office building. I was in the middle of debugging a particularly complex algorithm when the receptionist called to say someone needed my signature for an urgent delivery. The manila envelope was thick, official-looking, with the return address of Thornton and Associates stamped in embossed letters across the top. I opened it in the elevator on my way back to my desk. Victoria had finally pulled the trigger. The petition for dissolution of marriage was 23 pages long, professionally prepared, and aggressive in its assumptions about our financial situation. She was requesting spousal support of $15,000 per month, 50% of all marital assets, and exclusive use of our apartment until the property settlement was finalized. The document painted me as a marginally successful software engineer whose entrepreneurial ventures had generated modest supplemental income but no substantial wealth. Victoria's attorney had clearly based their strategy on the financial picture I'd been carefully maintaining throughout our marriage, the deliberate appearance of middle-class struggle that had made my actual asset accumulation invisible to everyone, including my wife. I called Catherine Walsh from my office and scheduled an emergency meeting for that afternoon. She reviewed Victoria's petition with the calm precision of someone who'd seen every possible variation of divorce litigation. Her assessment was straightforward. Victoria's legal team had made several strategic errors based on incomplete information about our actual financial situation. They're asking for spousal support based on your apparent income from employment and your visible business activities, Walsh explained. But they haven't discovered the investment partnerships, the licensing agreements, or the equity positions that represent the majority of your actual wealth. They're fighting over the wrong assets. The beauty of my financial structure was that it had been designed for exactly this situation. Not because I'd anticipated divorce specifically, but because I'd learned early in my entrepreneurial career that asset protection was essential for anyone building substantial wealth in the technology industry. The corporate entities, investment partnerships, and licensing agreements that generated most of my income were legally separate from the marital community property that Victoria could claim. Walsh's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. We would respond to Victoria's petition by providing complete and accurate financial disclosure, as required by law, but we would present the information in a way that demonstrated how dramatically her legal team had miscalculated our situation. Instead of hiding assets or engaging in financial manipulation, we would overwhelm them with transparency that revealed the sophistication of my actual business operations. The first step was preparing comprehensive financial statements that documented every aspect of my income and asset structure. This required coordination between Walsh, my accountant Roberta Martinez, and my business attorney Sarah Kim. We assembled a team of financial experts who could explain the complex corporate structures and investment vehicles that characterized my actual wealth. The process was exhausting but illuminating. I'd been so focused on maintaining operational security that I'd never fully calculated my own net worth. When Martinez completed his analysis, the number was startling even to me. Between my equity positions in various startups, my licensing agreements with major technology companies, and my investment portfolio, my assets were worth substantially more than I'd realized. More importantly, the structure we'd built was legally bulletproof. The business entities that held my significant assets had been properly documented and capitalized. The investment partnerships were governed by operating agreements that clearly established my ownership interests. The licensing deals were protected by contracts that would survive any divorce proceeding. Victoria would be entitled to half of our joint savings account and her portion of our furniture, but the real wealth was beyond her reach. Meanwhile, Fletcher's investigation continued to document Victoria's financial misconduct and personal deception. His latest report included evidence that she'd been systematically inflating her business expenses and using corporate credit cards to fund her affairs. More damaging were recorded conversations in which Victoria discussed her divorce strategy with her sister Emma, including specific plans to claim assets that she knew she had no legal right to. The recordings were devastating. Victoria laughed about my supposed naivete, joked about taking me for everything I was worth, and expressed confidence that her family's legal connections would ensure a favorable outcome regardless of the actual merits of her case.
She described me as pathetically grateful for having married above my station and predicted that I would accept whatever settlement she offered rather than risk an extended court battle. David doesn't have the backbone for a real fight, she told Emma during one recorded phone conversation.
He'll cave the moment things get uncomfortable. I just need to push hard enough to make him realize he's outmatched. The irony was breathtaking. Victoria had spent years underestimating my capabilities and resolve, interpreting my preference for avoiding conflict as weakness rather than strategic patience. She convinced herself that I was dependent on her social status and family connections, that I would be lost without her guidance and support. She had no idea that I've been building a completely independent foundation for my life and career. Walsh scheduled a settlement conference for early June, giving Victoria's legal team time to conduct their own asset investigation. We anticipated that they would discover some of my business activities during their due diligence process, but we were confident that they wouldn't understand the full scope or structure of my financial position until we chose to reveal it. The settlement conference took place in a sterile conference room at Thornton & Associates, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay. Victoria arrived dressed like she was attending a board meeting, her confidence radiating across the room. She barely made eye contact with me, treating the proceeding like a business transaction that she expected to conclude on favorable terms. Margaret Thornton, Victoria's attorney, was exactly what I'd expected based on her reputation. Sharp, aggressive, and supremely confident in her ability to intimidate opposing counsel. She opened the conference by presenting Victoria's settlement demands, which had actually increased since the initial petition. Victoria now wanted $20,000 per month in spousal support, 60% of all marital assets, and exclusive ownership of our apartment. Mr. Chen has benefited tremendously from his association with the Whitmore family, Thornton argued. Victoria's connections and social capital have been instrumental in whatever modest business success he's achieved. Given the disparity in their respective earning capacities and social positions, substantial spousal support is clearly appropriate. Walsh listened to this presentation with polite attention, taking notes but offering no immediate response. When Thornton finished, Walsh smiled and said, "Thank you for that perspective. We have a somewhat different view of the financial realities involved in this case." She opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder containing the comprehensive financial disclosure we'd prepared. "Before we discuss settlement terms, I think everyone should have a clear understanding of the actual asset picture we're dealing with." The next 20 minutes were among the most satisfying of my life. Walsh methodically walked through each component of my business structure, explaining the revenue streams, equity positions, and investment returns that had been accumulating outside Victoria's awareness for years. She presented documentation for licensing agreements with millions of dollars, equity stakes in companies that were preparing for public offerings, and investment partnerships that generated substantial passive income. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions that I'll remember forever. Initial confusion as she tried to understand what Walsh was describing, growing alarm as the scope of my actual wealth became clear, finally, pure rage as she realized how completely she'd miscalculated our situation. "This is impossible," Victoria said, interrupting Walsh's presentation. "David works for a software company. He makes maybe $90,000 a year. This is all fantasy." Walsh smiled and handed her a stack of tax returns, corporate filings, and bank statements. "I assure you, Mrs. Chen, these assets are quite real and fully documented. Your husband has been considerably more successful than you appear to have realized." Thornton was frantically taking notes, clearly trying to understand how her legal strategy had been based on such fundamentally incorrect assumptions. She asked for a recess to review the documentation with her client, and Victoria practically dragged her from the conference room. I could hear Victoria's voice through the thin walls, alternating between shocked questions and angry accusations. She was demanding to know how Thornton could have missed such obvious financial information, while Thornton was trying to explain that her investigation had been based on the financial picture that Victoria herself had provided. When they returned 40 minutes later, Victoria looked like a different person. The supreme confidence had been replaced by barely contained fury.
She stared at me like she'd never seen me before, like I'd somehow deceived her through the simple act of being more competent than she'd assumed. Thornton's revised settlement position was dramatically different. Instead of demanding substantial spousal support, she was now arguing that Victoria's own career prospects and family resources meant that she didn't need financial assistance. Instead of claiming major assets, she was focusing on protecting Victoria's separate property and ensuring that she wasn't somehow disadvantaged by the complexity of my business structure. Walsh's counteroffer was reasonable but firm. Victoria would receive her share of our genuinely joint assets, which amounted to our savings account, her personal belongings, and half the value of the furniture we'd purchased together. She would not receive spousal support, given her own earning capacity and family wealth. She would have 60 days to vacate the apartment, which was leased in her name and which I had no interest in retaining. We're also prepared to discuss the financial irregularities that our investigation has uncovered, Walsh added quietly. Mr. Chen is willing to resolve this matter amicably, but only if Mrs. Chen is prepared to be equally reasonable in her expectations. This was our leverage regarding Victoria's misuse of corporate resources and potential securities violations.
We weren't threatening to report her misconduct, but we were making it clear that her own legal exposure created limits on how aggressively she could pursue divorce claims. Victoria looked like she wanted to explode. She whispered urgently with Thornton for several minutes, then announced that she needed more time to consider our offer. The conference ended with an agreement to reconvene in 2 weeks, giving both sides time to reassess their positions. As we left the building, Victoria cornered me in the parking garage. This was the first time we'd spoken directly since the divorce papers had been filed, and her anger was palpable. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Hiding money, playing the poor little engineer while you were getting rich behind my back." "I wasn't hiding anything, Victoria. You never asked about my business activities, and you made it clear that you weren't interested in the details of my work. Don't give me that innocent act. You knew exactly what you were doing. You let me think you were some struggling entrepreneur while you were making millions. I was building something valuable while you were focused on other priorities. If you'd been paying attention to our marriage instead of planning your exit strategy, you might have noticed." She stepped closer, her face flushed with anger. "Exit strategy? What are you talking about?" "I know about the affairs, Victoria. I know about the financial misconduct. I know you've been planning this divorce for months while lying to me about everything." For a moment, she looked genuinely shocked, as if she couldn't believe that I'd discovered her deception. Then her expression hardened into something cold and calculating. "You can't prove any of that." "Actually, I can. I have documentation, photographs, recordings. Everything you've been doing for the past year is thoroughly documented." Victoria stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her recalculating everything she thought she knew about our situation. She'd built her entire divorce strategy on the assumption that I was passive, naive, and dependent on her social connections. The reality that I'd been systematically documenting her misconduct while building substantial independent wealth was clearly a shock she wasn't prepared for. "This isn't over," she said finally. "Yes, it is. You just haven't accepted it yet." The final settlement negotiations took place 3 weeks later. Victoria had apparently spent the intervening time consulting with additional attorneys, trying to find someone who could identify weaknesses in my financial structure or legal vulnerabilities that could be exploited. She'd found none. Thornton's final offer was essentially an acceptance of our original terms. Victoria would take her personal belongings, her share of our minimal joint assets, and walk away from the marriage without spousal support or claims on my business interests. In exchange, we would not pursue any legal action regarding her financial misconduct or report her professional violations to regulatory authorities. The agreement was signed on a cloudy Tuesday in July. Victoria barely spoke during the proceeding, maintaining her dignity, but clearly defeated. The confident, controlling woman who had dominated our marriage for years had been replaced by someone who looked diminished, uncertain, almost fragile. Judge Richardson's final hearing was a formality, but it provided the dramatic conclusion that made everything feel complete. When he read the asset disclosure statement into the court record, when he announced my actual net worth for the official transcript,
Victoria's composure finally cracked completely. She turned to stare at me with an expression of pure disbelief, as if she still couldn't believe that the passive, grateful husband she'd taken for granted had been systematically building a fortune while she was planning his destruction. The numbers echoed through the courtroom like thunder, transforming everything about how our relationship would be remembered. The court finds that the financial disclosure provided by Mr. Chen is complete and accurate. The substantial assets he has accumulated through his business activities are properly classified as separate property, having been developed through entities and partnerships that predate the marriage or were funded entirely through his separate efforts. Victoria's attorney made no objection. There was nothing to object to. No legal argument that could transform my systematic asset protection into community property subject to division. The court hereby grants the petition for dissolution of marriage and approves the settlement agreement as presented. The parties are hereby declared to be single persons, free to remarry. I walked out of that courtroom feeling lighter than I had in years, not because I'd won some kind of victory over Victoria, but because I was finally free from a relationship that had become toxic and manipulative. The woman I'd loved had been replaced by someone who saw me as a resource to be exploited, and it had taken me far too long to accept that reality.
Victoria tried to contact me several times in the weeks following our divorce. Text messages that alternated between rage and attempted reconciliation, voicemails that suggested we could work things out if I were willing to be more reasonable about the financial settlement. I didn't respond to any of them. I moved out of the Belltown apartment and bought a house in Wallingford, a craftsman bungalow with a view of Green Lake that felt like home in a way the expensive penthouse never had. I furnished it simply, focusing on comfort and functionality rather than status and impression management. My business continued to grow rapidly now that I could focus completely on development and expansion rather than managing marital conflict. The inventory platform evolved into a comprehensive business management suite that attracted major corporate clients. The licensing agreements generated enough passive income to fund additional investment opportunities and business partnerships. I started dating again after several months, but carefully, with a much clearer understanding of what I was looking for in a partner. I wanted someone who was interested in my actual life and work, not someone who saw me as a project to be improved or a resource to be managed. I wanted genuine partnership rather than performance and manipulation. The most surprising development was reconnecting with old friends who had gradually disappeared during my marriage to Victoria. Marcus, my college roommate, admitted that he'd felt unwelcome in our social circle and had assumed I'd outgrown our friendship. Other friends had similar stories about feeling excluded from my life after Victoria had made it clear that they didn't meet her standards for appropriate social connections. I realized that Victoria had systematically isolated me from relationships that might have provided perspective on how our marriage was evolving. She'd replaced my organic social connections with her own network, people who shared her values and priorities, and who would reinforce her view of what my life should look like. It was another form of control that I'd accepted without fully understanding its implications. The financial misconduct that Fletcher had documented eventually caught up with Victoria in ways that had nothing to do with our divorce. The Securities and Exchange Commission launched an investigation into trading irregularities at her family's investment firm, focusing specifically on activities that matched the pattern of misconduct we'd uncovered. Victoria was placed on administrative leave while the investigation proceeded. I learned about this development through news reports rather than direct communication. The investigation was public record, and the financial press covered it as a case study in how family wealth and social connections couldn't protect people from regulatory enforcement when the evidence was clear. I felt no satisfaction in Victoria's professional downfall. Her misconduct had been her choice, and the consequences were appropriate regardless of how they affected our personal relationship. I'd moved on to building a life that was focused on my own goals and values, rather than on conflicts with people who'd chosen to be adversaries. The final irony was that Victoria's assessment of my character had been simultaneously completely wrong and perfectly accurate. She'd been right that I preferred to avoid conflict, and that I was more comfortable building things than fighting over them.
but she'd been catastrophically wrong in assuming that these traits made me weak or manipulable. I was exactly the same person I'd always been, methodical, patient, focused on long-term results rather than short-term victories. The difference was that I'd finally applied these characteristics to protecting myself rather than trying to save a relationship that the other person had already destroyed. Looking back, I understand that Victoria probably never loved me in any meaningful sense. She'd been attracted to the idea of dating outside her social circle, the novelty of a relationship with someone who was building something rather than inheriting it. But when the novelty wore off and I didn't transform into the sophisticated socialite she'd apparently expected, she'd grown bored and resentful. The elaborate deception and systematic planning for divorce weren't expressions of hatred or even disappointment. They were simply the most efficient way for her to extract herself from a relationship that no longer served her purposes, while maximizing her financial benefit from the process. She'd approached our marriage like a business venture that had failed to meet its projected returns. I harbor no anger toward Victoria for this approach. We're simply different people with incompatible values and life goals. The mistake was thinking that love could bridge those differences without both parties being willing to genuinely understand and accept each other's perspectives. My life now is quieter, more focused, infinitely more peaceful. I wake up each morning in a house I own, working on projects I'm passionate about, surrounded by people who value me for who I actually am, rather than who they think I could become with proper management. Sometimes I think about the man I was during those final years of marriage, constantly questioning my own perceptions, doubting my worth, accepting treatment that I would never tolerate from anyone else. That person feels like a stranger now, someone I remember with sympathy but can barely recognize as myself. The divorce taught me that self-respect isn't something you can negotiate or compromise. Either you maintain clear boundaries about how people are allowed to treat you, or you gradually lose yourself in the process of trying to keep peace with people who have no interest in your actual well-being. Victoria's assumption that I would remain passive and accepting in the face of systematic betrayal was her greatest strategic error, but it was also a gift because it forced me to rediscover capabilities and resolve that I'd forgotten I possessed. The man who walked out of that courtroom was stronger, clearer, and more confident than the one who'd walked into that marriage 8 years earlier. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.